Well, welcome. Thank you so much for spending an hour with us this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. Super excited to talk about nature-based solutions today. I've just come back from a trip to Detroit and then Seattle. So I got to see some really cool nature-based solutions in place in two very different communities that have issues with both flooding and polluted runoff. And so it's very much on my mind on the heels of that trip. Um, while we're waiting, if you feel inspired to use the Q&A to share some wonky words or phrases that you have struggled or that you've used in the past or heard to describe green or natural infrastructure, I'd love to know. And then we'll have some interactive time a little bit later on to workshop those phrases together. And I'll also share as a follow-up to this webinar, we have like a co-created spreadsheet at the Water Hub that anyone can add to that's like wonky words and smart switches. So I'll include that as a follow-up. And then if there are words that you haven't gotten to or that you would like thought partnership to translate, I'm happy to work on those together. Before we dive into the content, would love to briefly introduce myself and the Water Hub. I'm Nicole Lampe. I'm managing director of the Water Hub, based in Portland, Oregon, on Clackamas and Clatsop lands. I've been working in cause communications for about 15 years, and on freshwater, various kinds of challenges and solutions in the freshwater world for about a decade. And for those who don't know us yet, the Water Hub is a communication shop that works in service of the water movement. We have grant funding to provide free hands-on help. We focus our hands-on help on grassroots groups that don't have a lot of communications capacity themselves, but we also have offerings for everyone who works on water, including trainings, guides, like we have guides on ethical storytelling and photography and on how to manage like constructive conversations on digital media, all sorts of things. And then we also do a fair amount of media analysis and polling. And I'm going to actually share some polling results today to start us off. So the plan for the hour is I'm going to share some research that gives us a little bit more insights into what people already understand about nature-based solutions in green infrastructure, as well as like some of the gaps in awareness. I'm going to share like a basic formula for messaging, and then some examples of like ways to apply this messaging formula to the world of nature-based solutions. And then some fun examples from the wild of good signage, of good brochures, of quotes in press that really get at the why of nature-based solutions, like what's the benefit. And lastly, we'll have time to workshop some messaging and to do Q&A. For now, I'll dig into the research. And by the way, if questions come up while I'm talking, feel free to drop them in the chat and I'll pause and look after each session, after each section. So the headline from polling, as well as other research and focus groups that's been done, is that people really like the idea of working with nature to manage climate change, to support clean water, to support water supply reliability, all those things. And there seems like there is a sort of like natural understanding, I think, among people that like when we work with nature, there are a range of benefits. It also holds really well across political divides, and I'll share some specifics to back that up momentarily. This is from Walton Family Foundation's poll that was released around Earth Day this year. They found that 3/4 of Americans agree that when we invest in clean air, water, and healthy rivers and forests, people and communities thrive. As you can see, there were only 13 percentage points difference between Democrats and Republicans here. And one of the reasons that I think the response to this question, which was a poll, was so positive, is that they talked about some of the why here, right? Clean air, clean water, healthy rivers and forests. Like those are things that people immediately grasp the value of. And that, including the why, is a theme that we notice tends to increase, like the positive response in polling, as well as, in social sharing, in talking with reporters, et cetera. So this is from the Water Hub's own poll. We do annual polling, a national poll each year, and we actually have a national poll coming out in September, or excuse me, in October. So if you have not yet signed up for our newsletter, we'll share the results there. We're going to dig more into nature-based solutions, but we're also asking a bunch of questions about resilience and how people interpret that term, et cetera. Susan, I see your hand up. Let's see, I'm going to look in the Q&A. Susan, did you drop your question in the Q&A? Okay, Susan, you can speak now. Susan? Oh, sorry, there was an accident. Great. Yeah, if you could use the Q&A, great. If there's something that comes up that's super time sensitive and specific to a slide, feel free to raise your hand and I will unmute you and we can address it right then. So as I was saying, we have a poll coming out in October, and this is from our last year's poll where we found that 82% of voters support investing in rain gardens and parks to reduce runoff. These are from US Nature for Climate's poll from February. They found really high support and again, very little difference between Democrats and Republicans for planting trees to provide shade, reduce heat and lower energy costs, protecting grasslands to support wildlife and improve water quality, and incentivizing farmers to plant cover crops that reduce erosion and increase water efficiency. And I included all three of these examples because I wanted to point out that they get actually sort of progressively more technical, the why, as you go on. So provide shade, reduce heat, and lower energy costs is really simple language, right? When you get to like improve water quality, I think protect clean water is a simpler way to say that is going to appeal to more people. And similarly, like reducing erosion and increasing water efficiency, we might say like save water and keep more soil on the land or something. So again, we'll talk more about specific language as we get in, but the sort of like overarching guidance that we like to offer is the simpler the terms, generally, the more accessible and therefore the more engaging. And speaking of terminology, we actually, in our last poll, asked people, we described the solution set, parks, rain gardens, et cetera, and asked people, and also things like wetlands and meadows, and asked people what term they thought best described this set of solutions. And nature-based solutions performed much better than natural infrastructure or green infrastructure. And we were sort of talking amongst ourselves at the Water Hub to try to figure out why. And we guess that the term infrastructure, either people perceive a conflict, that they really think of infrastructure as being like roads and bridges and things that are built, or that term itself feels sort of like technical. So in any case, we tend to now lean on the term nature-based solutions at the Water Hub. One more slide from our polling, or actually there's two more. This was a question about flood controls, and we found that people really like the idea of built flood controls like pumps and levees. That is understandable, but also natural flood controls like wetlands and floodplains. So almost equal support. And then we were talking about drought-prone communities. We asked about like restoration as well as conservation, as well as recycling and reuse. And we found that they all performed really well, but the restoration and protection solutions actually perform better than new water sources, than recycling or conservation and efficiency. And I'll pause here to look at the Q&A because we're going to move on next to image research. Yes, I know that. Oh, thank you, Marco. Let's see. Was there a question in the poll that included making monetary investments in long-term maintenance? No, we have not asked about long-term maintenance, Larissa. I will include a link to last year's poll in the follow-ups, and and then you can dig into the details. Someone asked if we use the term ecological restoration. We did not use that term, haven't tested it. And yes, we do have all of this data available on our website. We have both our own polling report, but then I also recently did a polling summary looking at recent water and climate polling and specifically dug into research around nature-based solutions. Okay, now shifting gears a little bit. At the Water Hub, we often focus on words. The written word obviously is a really powerful tool for communications, but in this era of, everyone being on their phones and scanning social media, imagery is also a really important way to communicate. And so I wanted to share some research that my former colleagues at Resource Media did in partnership with Washington Environmental Council a few years ago, looking at like how people receive different images of green infrastructure, specifically in an urban setting and with an emphasis on transit and bike, safety. So they tested these three different images and asked people which one best represents a livable city to them. And they performed the best as you head right. So this leftmost one, that's like an overhead sort of strange angle. They thought that it might do well because it actually shows like a parent on a bike with two children behind. And they thought, well, it's clearly showing like bike safety and it's also showing that this is family friendly. Did not do very well. The middle one performed better, and their interpretation was it's because it's at street level and you can actually see faces. And then the far right one performed the best. And their takeaway here was like, well, this, like in this case, the park is really showing like how green infrastructure can be a space for gathering and connection and community. And also there's clearly diversity pictured in this photo. And they were really intentional in this image testing of having the audience be racially and ethnically diverse. And I'll share one more image test from this project that Resource Media did. They wanted to test pictures of rain gardens and bioswales. And often, I think, when we're trying to show pictures of green infrastructure, we have the impulse to show like mature plantings to show how beautiful it's going to look when it's really thriving, the plants. And they asked people like, what kind of project would you be most likely to support in your community? And the one on the right performed better. Obviously, this is an immature planting. You don't see anything in bloom. You can tell that it's like, a sort of like dry river bed that's sunken with some planting and mulch around it. But their guess was this performed really well because it's clearly a public amenity. So on the left, there's no context, could be a private home. On the right, this is clearly a sidewalk. We know that a lot of disinvested communities that struggle with flooding also don't have safe routes to school or bike lanes or sidewalks with curb cuts for people pushing strollers or people in wheelchairs. And so showing the way that green infrastructure often can live alongside and be installed at the same time as like public safety infrastructure, I think tends to help people appreciate the full value. So these were the sort of top line takeaways that Resource Media took away from this. And I'll also include a link to their write-up of their research here. The first thing, as I said, is benefits over beauty. So showing sidewalks, parks, and bike paths alongside it helps people understand that this is a public amenity and that it's going to improve safety and livability in communities. They did some focus groups, and one of the things they noticed in the focus groups was that people of color were more likely to raise cost concerns and also raise concerns around like exclusivity or displacement, gentrification, necessity. So I think like communicating proactively what is being done to mitigate those concerns, and also in many cases the cost savings associated with green infrastructure, while also, I think it was Larissa's point, acknowledging that there's like long-term maintenance required when you install green infrastructure is an important part of communications. And then, as I said, like making sure that the people pictured reflect the audience. And lastly, they did ask questions around perceptions of like, do you think that investing in rain gardens, parks, and green streets is going to bring jobs to the community? And that wasn't something that came up for people. So if that is a key talking point and a key like part of a project that you're working on, then I think it's important to proactively communicate that. Let me just peek at the Q&A before we move on. Kelly asked if your polling had participants rank or score protection of natural infrastructure versus economic development. No. Um, we we have asked questions before to see if people perceive an inherent conflict between environmental health and economic development, and most people do not. But we didn't ask that specifically in the context of urban green infrastructure. We will share this presentation with attendees. And Connor, we haven't told about job creation, I don't think, but we actually did some a message testing online. Before the bipartisan infrastructure law passed, the Water Hub did a little campaign to try to make a jobs and economic case for investing in water at the federal level. And when we tested creative that emphasized jobs, we found that it performed less well than some of our other creatives. So I think that it's an area that we could definitely explore, including in future polls. Larissa is asking, why do people of color see nature-based solutions as expensive and unnecessary? Is there an association with gentrification? I think that's right. In this case, I wasn't part of these focus groups that Resource Media facilitated, and they didn't include super detailed notes. But my guess is yes. And Kelly's asking, curious how the public ranks or scores potential conflicting interests or perceived conflicting interests. Yeah, always, every time we do a poll, it surfaces more questions that we'd love to dig into. So feel free when we send out our polling report in October, we will invite follow-up questions and then we'll keep notes on those for our next poll. So definitely feel free to weigh in with areas that you think are ripe for additional exploration. Okay, we're going to move on now to like how to message this to the words piece. One of my longtime colleagues, when I was coming up in the communications world, said like the number one thing you need to remember as a communicator is to meet people where they are. And he meant both physically, right? Like going to the places where people look for news, look for information, share information with friends and family, but also like in terms of values, like if you start with their concerns, the concerns of your audience, and like and bridge from there to the project or policy or proposal that you're working on, that's a good place to start. And so this is a formula that lots of communications practitioners use for building a message. And a message is simply the sort of like very simple like phrase or argument that you want your audience to retain. So when they read a brochure, when they've looked at an Instagram post, when they've read a news story, it's like, what's the takeaway? And we want the takeaway to do three things at least. We want it to communicate the why, like the value. So is this about health? Is this about public safety? Is this about pride of place and making our community thrive? Is it about responsibility to future generations, et cetera? The problem is like, what are we trying to fix here? And then the solution is less emphasis on the process and the specific installation or project that you're proposing, and more on like what's the benefit. We often say payoff, not the process. So in terms of values, there's lots of polling that has dug into like what are the sort of core values that resonate across generations, across racial and ethnic groups, and across political parties. And these are among them: health and safety, home and family, responsibility to future generations, care for the natural world, and pride of place. And so if you can sort of start there, and you all know better than I do what values really resonate in your communities. In terms of problems, here, again, we want to be as specific as possible. So this could be like flooded basements. It could be lakes choked with algae that people can no longer swim in summer. It could be wells running dry in the heat of summer. So rather than using the sort of like broad and technical terms like, aridification or dropping groundwater levels or, poor stormwater management, like really painting a picture with words here. And same thing for the solutions. So in some cases, we wouldn't even emphasize the water or climate benefits. So, per that research from Resource Media, if what people really value about a neighborhood greening project is that it suddenly becomes more walkable or bikeable, then maybe we lead with that. If the shade is the thing that's really like the most important, or if a place to picnic and play, or if, fit healthy fisheries or a place to swim, again, leading with the benefit for communities that may or may not be the priority for your organization or for the policy or funding pool that you're tapping. And as I said before, simple terms work better. And so we have a whole, as I said, an interactive spreadsheet that is like wonky words and simple swaps. And I'll share that after the fact. But here are just a couple. Stormwater is obviously something that a lot of people who work on green infrastructure talk about. It's not a word that I'd ever heard before I started working on water. And if I said it to my dad or to my neighbor, I think they would be able to infer what it meant. But I think it would be much clearer if I said runoff or rain running off streets and lawns. And if you already describe like rain running off streets and lawns or parking lots and pavement, then you can immediately jump to like what chemicals is it picking up, what pollution is it picking up, and then where have you seen it pooling rather than running off, and what do we need to do about that? Similarly, like terms like impermeable, pervious, infiltrate, like just again describing what the effect or intention is. And yeah, bioswale is one of the sort of words in urban green infrastructure that, some of them like rain garden, I think makes sense intuitively. Bioswale does not make sense intuitively. And so I often describe it as a sunken planter. If you all have awesome alternatives to bioswale, I'd love to hear, and any other great swaps that you've come up with. So yeah, actually would love for you to drop in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you have one. What are some wonky words that you have struggled to translate, or that you already have a great alternative for? And actually, I'm going to drop, I just dropped the link in the Q&A in response to, oh, now it's answered. Sorry, I can actually drop it in the chat. There is the water words alternatives spreadsheet. Can you swap bioswale with rain garden? Colleen asks. Absolutely. Yes. I think that there is no reason that it needs to be that we need to be like super precise. Multi-benefit environmental outcomes, Nashley is asking. Ooh, yeah, I think multi-benefit itself is like makes sense. It's a word that many people wouldn't use, but that probably makes sense to people. But here I think like I often default with these like technical terms to using more words. So rather than saying like multi-benefit environmental outcomes, like for the specific policy or project you're envisioning, like I would literally describe what we're going to get out of them. Michael's asking about nutrients and nutrient pollution, one of the biggest communications challenges in the Mississippi River Basin. And yes, so many other places. Yeah, nutrients is a word that I think to people immediately sounds like a good thing, right? It sounds like vitamins. And so we don't talk about nutrients when we're talking about nitrogen and phosphorus or agricultural runoff, because I think like, unless you're talking to a technical audience, thank you, Lynn and others. I will change the permissions momentarily. It doesn't make sense. So yeah, I think, Michael, this is another case where like more words may help, although I'm happy to workshop this whole issue in greater detail, but literally describing like fertilizer and manure that is running off fields or leaks from poorly maintained septic tanks that are running into rivers and fueling toxic algae. So lots more words than nutrient pollution, but I think the more you can paint a picture and describe the why. Why is it a problem? Well, it's a problem because it can fuel toxic algae. It's a problem because it can contaminate drinking water, or it can drive up treatment costs for drinking water, right? So I think the more specific we can be, the better. And let me just change the permission on this spreadsheet. Actually, I'm sorry, I'm not going to do that right now. I will have it be shareable when we hang up. And Michael asked, are you seeing success with talking about nitrogen and phosphorus? No, I have not. I also wouldn't talk about nitrogen and phosphorus, as you said, leading into pollution, ag runoff, fertilizer pollution, et cetera. Like the more specific and sort of graphic visual you can be, the better. And yes, apologies about the spreadsheet. Okay. So I wanted to share a couple of fun examples of signage and brochures that I think have done a good job emphasizing the why, and also using really accessible visual language. And then we're going to have a little bit of time to workshop your own nature-based solutions messaging. So this is from Chicago's Green Schoolyards program, Room to Grow. And this is signage. They've installed a bunch of green infrastructure in schoolyards. This is a rain garden. And in case you can't read it, it's a little bit small text. It says, butterflies and bees love it here. See any? So already inviting interactivity. And then it says, these plants like having wet feet. The sides of the garden slope down to capture rainwater. And it's a nice picture that shows like the actual like sunken part of the rain garden, the roots, and then the materials below that are that have been placed there to increase infiltration. And yeah, I'll just say at my daughter's school, like flooding in the play area on the sort of like asphalt part of the playground happens all the time. And so, if that were a problem, then like communicating, like I've seen some really effective before and afters on signage at green infrastructure installations, just showing like, previously this playground used to have like a puddle when it rained, and now we have, these sunken gardens that help give the rain a place to go and to sink in so that the playground remains available for kids to play in. Like even more of the why, I think if this were a school that had previously had flooding, could be nice. This is from a partnership with Gonzaga University and some nonprofits where they were engaging engineering students in building beaver dam analogs, which for those of you who don't know are like human-made barriers that act like beaver dams to create like ponding and slow down water. And they created a slideshow and brochure. And I really liked a couple of the words they used here: cheap and cheerful. So communicating like cost effectiveness. They also talk about, that it slows the water, it creates ponds. They get into settling sediment and phosphorus, which is a little wonky here. And then they talk about making the lake cleaner in a low cost, safe and eco-friendly way. And here they have given you like, an example of the actual installation and then showing what it does. Like it actually helps water spread out and slow down. This is from a bioswale, which I love the alternative of calling bioswales rain gardens. And it says this oversized tree pit, which I really like. It does go into a little bit more technical detail below that. It says it's filled with plants, sand, gravel, and engineered soil, which are specifically designed to absorb water. Inlets divert rainwater from the street into the bioswale instead of to storm drains. So again, this is sort of like a mix of really clear and slightly technical, but I think it does a good job of the why. Like this tree pit is here, it's supposed to soak up water slowly, and these like cuts that you see that let water in off the street, they prevent water from going into storm drains. And I think if you live in a rainy place like I do in Portland, Oregon, then you've invariably seen storm drains that are choked with leaves or grass or other garbage and are not actually doing the job of letting water run in. And so I think like people in flood prone areas will intuitively get the value of taking water out of the storm drains and putting it somewhere else. Connor is asking if I've seen any projects that use multilingual signage. I have. I actually came across a couple when I was doing research for this slideshow, and so I can share some examples. But also, I will welcome people to share more if you have really great multilingual signage, either that your organization has worked on or that you've seen around your community. Because obviously, the more languages you need to include, the less space you have for text. Um, this is a sign, like an interpretive sign about floodplains. And I was just talking with Lacey from American Rivers last week about how floodplains are one of the really, really hardworking nature-based solutions that needs a rebrand, right? Because I think that if you don't work in water, the idea of a floodplain sounds like it may actually like cause flooding rather than relieve flooding. And I thought this sign has some nice language. It talks about coloring outside the lines. It talks about a meander makes a difference. And then it actually shows like the before and after. It shows the floodplain. And it talks about how the floodplain like allows water to overflow the banks and then to leave soil on that area that then is good for fish and all sorts of other things. So I think it does a good job of the why, both graphically and with words. And I have one more. This is just words. This is a quote from Brad Lancaster of Tucson, Arizona, who talks a lot about planting rain, right? He talks about green infrastructure in an arid and hot context. And if you haven't seen, I'll include a link to his website, harvestingrainwater.com, in the follow-up materials. It has really great examples of before and afters. And he is an incredibly skillful spokesperson. And so this was just a quote from, I think, a news article. He said, "You get to walk these wonderful tunnels of edible shade." In his neighborhood in Tucson, they've prioritized planting native plants that are edible. He says, "We've got over 24 native bird species that have returned to our neighborhood since we've regrown their habitat that sing as you walk along. We have bicycle boulevards that used to be speeding streets and lots more families than there used to be." He also talks a lot about the way that green infrastructure installations on the street, whether they're, curb bump outs or whether they're something in the middle, that they have a traffic calming effect. And so this idea of making communities more walkable or bikeable by slowing down traffic, I think, is another thing consistent with Resource Media's research that can help people appreciate all the value, right? Like all the multi benefits. Lynn is asking, is there a better term than watershed? I I think we actually might have one in our in the spreadsheet, but I think as with many things, it's harder. Like I don't know of a single word, although I've heard like waterscape and waterhood. But what we have in our spreadsheet is an area that drains into a river. Think of a sink. So I don't know if that is satisfactory as a swap. I think that's one that could probably use a little bit more workshopping. And if anyone has great alternatives to watershed, I've seen some really beautiful videos and like visualizations, but I think words it can be a little bit difficult. Oh, thank you, Erin. Erin just dropped into the Q&A from 7 million gallons, some rain garden resources in English, Spanish, Vietnamese, traditional Chinese, Somali, and Tigrinya. Okay, so I would love now for people to take 5 to 10 minutes, let's say 5 to 7 minutes, to get out a piece of paper or open a Google Doc or a Word document on your computer and practice in simple visual language describing one problem that you're working to solve through nature-based solutions. Can be in an urban context or can be, can be upstream or downstream. And then explain how the solution, the nature-based solution, will help. So emphasizing the why and the benefits that may or may not focus on water or climate. So I'll give you until 10:40. I'll check in at 10:45. And then I would love for some brave souls to raise their hands to unmute and share or drop their messages in the chat. And for now, well, I'll just leave this prompt up. Yes, I will make the Google Doc public. And yes, I'm aware that the chat is disabled. I am encouraging people to use the Q&A and or to raise their hand to be unmuted to share their messaging. I see another question in the chat. I will get to some of the questions after we reconvene and share some of the messaging people have been writing. Hey, we are at 5 minutes. I'm curious if anyone has written up some messaging. Doesn't have to be complete description of the problem and solution, but if anyone has some good language for problems or solutions that you'd either be willing to share in the chat or out loud. And if you'd like to share out loud, just raise your hand, please, and I will unmute you or make it so you can unmute yourself. Any brave souls? While you consider, I'm going to just quickly get to this question in the chat about how to communicate the scalability of nature-based solutions. This person wrote, I see you, Michael. Thank you. The localized benefits are really good, but can sometimes feel like a drop in the bucket. Again, here, I feel like this is my answer for everything, probably more words than scalability. So if you're talking about an urban setting, right, rather than talking about like just the individual installations. I've heard, Sponge City is a word, and Chesapeake Bay Foundation has this really great graphic that I've referred to many times in my career that talks about how cities can either be a green filter or a gray funnel, and shows like what does it look like when you have all this pavement and hard surfaces. Well, it allows pollution and toxins to be washed into our waterways. If you have, a green filter here, then it filters pollution as the rainwater slowly sinks into the ground. Similarly, when we're talking about, like healthy rivers, I've heard, people talking about giving rivers room or giving rivers room to roam. Um, so like communicating sort of like the sort of big picture of what you're trying to achieve through nature-based solutions, I think is a good way to communicate about scalability. And now I'm gonna go to Michael so that you can share. Michael, you should be,
All right. Thanks, Nicole. Yeah, I'm on my phone, but it looks like it's coming through all right. Can you hear me?
yeah, just fine.
Okay, great. Well, I love that last example about making room for the rivers. It's definitely things that we've experimented, and I loved your graphic about streams coloring outside the line, and immediately emailed one of the organizations. I see their logo on that graphic,
Mm.
so thank you for sharing that. The one I'll be brave and throw one out there in response to this, and it actually goes to the gray funnel and the green that you just had up on the slide there. But um, clean water keeps our communities safe and wildlife healthy. Pollution running off the land and into the water makes our water sick. Planting trees and native plants next to lakes and streams keeps pollution out of our water so it is safe and healthy. So was trying on your message framing there of value, problem, solution.
I love it. Yeah. And I really love that you said I can't remember if you said makes our river sick or makes our water sick, but I think that
Yeah.
concept of sick and healthy rather than talking about impairment or
Hmm.
contamination or even pollution, which we have polling that suggests that when people hear the word pollution, they're visualizing like plastic bags and bottles. They don't think about contaminants. So I think using a word like sick is immediately accessible and really like for me emotionally resonant. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, sounded great. I see Colleen dropped hers in the chat. She said Mountain Watershed Association uses a series of ponds, to clean polluted water from abandoned mines before it enters Indian Creek. Water passes through a series of filters and pipes that ends in a wetland full of cattails and sedges before it's directed back into the creek. There's a lot of things I love about this, Colleen. It's a little easier to retain visually than when I was listening to you, Michael. But I love that like explained like where the pollution is coming from. So abandoned mines, I think people immediately like have a picture of what sort of gunk might come out of an abandoned mine. Name the creek. That's probably a familiar place. And then you're describing, like painting a picture, including like cattails and sedges. Again, I think like talking about like a familiar plant also helps people get a sense of like what's a wetland, because that's a term that, right? I think wetland is a term that's primarily used by water people and lands people, and biodiversity and climate people, not so much by my friends who might say a swamp or a marsh. So really good job painting a picture. Anyone else feel inspired to share or have questions? Bob, I am aware that chat is disabled, and I'm sorry. My colleague Zakia just shared that this is actually a setting that we need to have changed, like at like when we're not live on Zoom. So I apologize for not having caught that previously. This is our first webinar since we like had this instance of Zoom. Um, Questions and or examples of messaging that you feel inspired to share. I also am happy if you have examples of great green infrastructure messaging that your organization has used or that you've seen around. Could be signage, could be brochures, could be graphics. I'm always eager to collect more examples of great. And I'm just scrolling up to see if there are other questions I might have missed. You're also welcome to raise your hand if you have a question. Just gonna hang out long enough to make it awkward. Oh, great. Kelsey just shared. Throwing out a non-water related nature-based solution. New England loses 30,000 acres of forest to development each year, where people love to hike, camp, and enjoy the outdoors. We can keep forests so that they can sequester carbon, be a healthy home to wildlife, clean the water and air, and provide a renewable resource alternative to plastics and other materials derived from fossil fuels. Great, Kelsey. I mean, you definitely communicated the value for people of healthy forests, hiking, camping, enjoying the outdoors, also slowing climate change and healthy home for wildlife, cleaning the air and water. I also like that you used healthy home instead of habitat because I think that is just more accessible language. And then, you know, even like the alternative, the renewable resource and alternative to fossil fuels. So thank you very much for sharing. Question from Catherine. Do you have tips for repairing broken public trust in green stormwater infrastructure after a failure of a project? For example, the rain garden in a prominent park was not maintained and was taken over by invasive vines. Yeah, that's a real that is a real challenge that we have heard from a lot of people that examples, you know, and further, like not just green infrastructure, we've heard a lot that in communities that have problems with really strong storms, that there's actually a fear of trees because there have been a lot of trees that have come down in hurricanes, for instance, on the Gulf Coast. And so when an organization is thinking about increasing tree canopy, either for water reasons or for shade and cooling reasons, there's a lot of fear. You need to make sure it's the right trees. You need to make sure they're planted in the right place. So, Catherine, I don't have a perfect tip for that. I welcome other people who do, but I will share that there is a new guide from River Network, and Water Now Alliance called the Building Blocks of Trust. That's a lot about like how to sort of restore trust and build trust with communities between utilities and communities. So that may have some useful insights. And then the Water Hub is actually going to be working on another sort of trust-based communications resource in the next few months. Hannah asked, are there any tips on how not to overpromise the extent to which green infrastructure can help with flooding, overflows, ponding? How can we better convey that green infrastructure is a great tool, but can't solve all urban stormwater problems alone? Hannah, I think that like people intuitively understand that. So if you'll remember, I can scroll back there in a moment. When we asked people about flooding solutions, there was almost equal support for built flood controls like pumps and levees, as there was for green flood controls or natural flood controls. And I think that voters intuitively understand and like the idea of using a combination. But I definitely hear you on we want to talk about all the benefits of green stormwater infrastructure, but we want to do it in a way that doesn't overpromise. And so I think just that, like talking about how this fits into or complements. And the one resource that I'll point to here, and I can drop this into the chat in a moment, along with that Building Blocks of Trust guide is Water Now Alliance has done quite a lot of work on distributed or, small scale infrastructure and how to communicate about it. And I think they do a good job of talking about how this distributed infrastructure, it's not an alternative to centralized infrastructure, right? It's a complement. It's like if the bones or the skeleton or the foundation is the centralized infrastructure, then nature-based solutions and other distributed infrastructure, small scale, localized infrastructure is like how you shore it up, how you strengthen it. Let me just pull that up. And then I'll give it one more minute for anyone else who has questions. And then we can give you a couple minutes back. This is Water Now Alliance's website on distributed infrastructure. And then let me pull up. And then I just dropped in the Building Blocks of Trust report from River Network and Water Now Alliance. With that, I will give you all 3 minutes back. Thank you so much for joining. As I said, by next week, early next week, I'll send out a follow-up with a summary, a link to the slides, the recording transcript, as well as all the resources that we talked about. And I'll make sure that the permissions on that wonky word spreadsheet allow everyone to comment. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for bearing with some of the technical challenges today. I appreciate you. Bye.